grappling with the issue of identity, of belonging. And Bijal, who writes primarily for children, she's a climate warrior and warrior, and that's kind of what she explores with her books. And I think I would like to begin with you, Daisy. To sort of take the theme of our discussion forward, can we sort of start with talking with all of you, sort of reflecting on where your stories come from? Both of you've written your first books, and perhaps you could tell us a little bit about the book for those of us who haven't read it yet, and also maybe where you think it comes from. So, uh,
Okay. Thank you, Ajitha. I'd just like to start by thanking Mary for rediscovering me in a way, because my book was published in 2010. So I do feel a bit like an imposter. It's not a new book. But Mary, thank you so much for curating such a vibrant and diverse festival in this beautiful setting, and for rediscovering my book and bringing me on this panel. So thank you. So the book actually started in the 2000s, so it's much more, it goes back, almost 20 years now. And it actually, it wasn't intended to be a novel. It was, I had finished my MA, and I was sort of at a loose end. I had come back to Shillong to teach. And I saw this call for entries. It was a workshop, the Tara Books, the feminist publishing house, Tara Books, and children's publishing had organized in collaboration with Max Muller Bhavan, and the idea was to generate literature that would cater to young adults. So it was felt that there's a gap in that sort of age group, that there's not enough contemporary literature, and the idea was to find new voices. So I sent in this handwritten piece on very flimsy pink paper, I remember, because computers were still a bit new territory, and they were intrigued. And then it took off from there, and the story developed. So that's where my story came from. Um, I can tell you a little bit about what the story is. Yeah. So it's set in Shillong in the of the early 80s, 1980s, and it is told from the perspective of children, children who are both Khasi children as well as children who are immigrants, so-called outsiders and insiders. And it really looks at how children negotiate difference, because they're aware that they're different, they're told that they're different, language and culture is different, and yet they feel akin, as they explore the world around them through love and friendship, they feel akin. And it's set in the political context of the 1980s, which is kind of like in Shillong history, a troubled period. It's a period where there's lots of agitation for identity and, things like that. So it's really this story of coming of age, and the one thing that is, and I think I love that word that was used in the earlier session. I think Amanda's talked about childom. So it is this childom, yeah, because it just explores this whole world of childhood, and looks at how the adult world is seen from a child's point of view. How it is quite secretive and can be dark and mysterious. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's what it's about.
Shundeep, I mean, because you've also published a novel that's sort of, around identity in one way. Would you sort of tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Thank you, and thank you to everybody who's come, and thank you, Mary, for inviting me to this festival. It was lovely to come back to Shillong at this time, and I wore my shirt to match the cherry blossom and pinkness around. But so if you feel a bit like an imposter, Daisy, I often felt like doubly imposter, not just because my book has also been a few years, but more so because I was not meant to be a writer at all. Like most sort of I grew up in Kolkata, and like most good Bengali boys, was gently but firmly steered towards engineering. I studied computer science, and I went to the US as a software engineer. And I was working in Silicon Valley, but I always loved to write. And Bengalis encourage these things, drawing or writing, as in they say, oh, my son or daughter has a knack for this and a knack for that. But it's not thought of as a profession per se. And it was in the US that I actually started writing for different magazines just because I liked, and volunteering for a gay and lesbian magazine that was out there. And I started writing these little short stories, some of which were published in anthologies, some of which I had kept. And I was in part of a writing group. And at some point in the 2000s, I actually quit my software job and went into journalism and media full time. And I didn't tell my family back home that I had done this. I just told them I had switched jobs. I told my sister, and eventually my mother got suspicious, and she asked my sister, does he still work in computers? And my sister, who is an English major and a professor in English, very carefully chose her words, and she said, he still works with a computer. And so at some point I had to come out about that. And I think that was much more difficult, coming out about that, than coming out as gay or anything. But then when I started to put this short stories together, somebody who had read the short story said, even though you think you're writing about all these different people and their secrets and their families and all of that, some are written in first person, some are written in third person, you are actually writing about the same family at different points in time. And it took me a while to get over the shock that my imagination was that limited, that I thought I was creating this world of characters, but I was really creating three characters, parents. But then I sort of thought of the idea, how about if we keep these as short stories, but somehow string them together into a larger novel. And that is how my book, Don't Let Him Know, became. It's a novel in short stories, and it's a novel about family secrets and about a son who discovers what he thinks is a terrible not terrible, but almost scandalous secret about his mother, but he doesn't know that even secrets have secrets. And this is the sort of story. And as you read the book, it hopefully unfurls these layers of secrecy. And the last thing I'll say, what I wanted to do in telling these stories was, it's a first novel, there are autobiographical elements in it, but I loved this idea of secrets because I thought that secrets were not always forbidding and terrible things. Some secrets were delicious, secrets that you nurtured close in heart. And I always, so there is a woman there who had an affair, mini affair with someone who became a film star. And years later, when she's married to someone else, she keeps his picture in these things. And there's one story where he has died, and she's looking at these pictures and reliving that secret.
That was a delightful story, like all of Shundip's stories, of course. Bijal, your work actually does not, sort of deal with this sort of thing at all, right? I mean, you're writing also for a very different kind of reader. In many ways, when we read as adults, we're also looking for the author maybe in the story, that sort of thing. Whereas you're writing for a reader who's just reading the story and is probably very focused on just the story and not where it came from. So where do your stories come from?
That's a great point because when I go into schools, especially to younger classrooms, half of the children are told that she wrote the book and they look at me and looks like, was there a person behind this book? And then they look in this shock, there's awe, and then there's, okay, now tell us the story. So children keep you in the straight and narrow as audiences. My stories come from I think my stories come from something that's happened as part of my work. I used to work a lot with nature. I still do. I worked with animals, I worked in tiger conservation, I worked in climate change. And every time I would take these jobs up, in some ways I would either end up writing about it or I would end up working with children around it. So suddenly these two worlds started colliding in my writing, where I came to believe, strongly believe that it's children who have the power to change the world. And so, which is where a cloud called Bhura comes from as well. It's based on this fictional brown cloud that comes and hovers on top of Mumbai. And it's kind of like I wanted to explore how climate change is no longer just a scientific phenomena, it's being defined by the way people perceive it. So, what does the media think about climate change? What do the politicians think about it? What do the adults think about it? What are the scientists saying? Can anyone understand them? So, all of that's there in the book. And then these four children who are just like, no, no, this is our future. This is our present at this point. We want answers and we want them now. And that leads them down this whole scientific adventure in some ways. And that's where Bhura comes from.
You know, that's actually a nice sort of point for us to also get to my next question, which is that, you know, for both of you, with identity being a part of your novels, and a very, very like central part of yours, how autobiographical are your works, you'd say? Like, I mean, where, where do you come into the writing of it, and how much, I mean, how do you sort of read yourself into or out of your stories?
Yeah, thanks, Ajitha, for that question. I think we were talking about it as first novels, I think, tend to be, because you're drawing a lot on, the experiential, I think, as opposed to, I guess, craft or experience, or, design in a way. So raw experience does come in to a large extent. The thing with what happened with me was, obviously it was drawn from diaries and letters, and there was an element of recollecting all that in tranquility in a way. So it's a process of distilling and distilling experience. But it also happened in dialogue, because it was part of this workshop. It was working with very experienced editors. So I guess that saved me a little bit from myself. Autobiography in that way is I guess negotiated in the book. Yeah, yeah.
My book actually has, it's kind of funny because a lot of people assume that because I identify as a gay man and my book has a gay character, that it is autobiographical. But actually the gay character is completely made up, who is a married gay man who has, a son. In fact, his son, who is, to me, the somewhat most boring character in the book, is the closest to me because he's the one who has gone to Silicon Valley and is working. It's like a nod to my previous life in Silicon Valley and that kind of orderliness. But as you write, Daisy, what I think as a first-time writer I draw on is not necessarily autobiography, but the memories of things around. We're writers are magpies. We steal bits and pieces from people and store them away and they sometimes appear when we don't even realize that they're coming out. But one of the things that was wonderful about writing, there is a story in the book about a great-grandmother. And I had the privilege of knowing my great-grandmother till, because she died when I was 14 or 15 years old. So the great-grandmother in the book is based on my own great-grandmother. And it was a real privilege, I would say, to sort of hear her voice in your head once again, some 30 years or whatever after she was gone. And writing that dialogue. My great grandmother and my mother used to fight all the time because my great grandmother liked to eat things that were she was not supposed to be eating at the age of 93. So she would, she would call the fruit seller and get mangoes on the side, or she would send the person who worked in our house to buy these deep fried telebhaja snacks, which she wasn't. And my mother would always find out and raise hell. And much of that book, that story is about that interaction between the two, and a child watching this. And my mother, when she read that chapter, the first comment she had was, she was like, I was not so mean to your great grandmother. And I said, Ma, that's fiction. It's fiction, but that part wasn't that fictional. But then later, I overheard my mother telling somebody that that was her favorite chapter in the book. So it was. And before just one other thing, there is one other piece. These things that are autobiographical, there are stray lines in there which now I realize come from memory. Like there is a scene where a man has died, and this little girl is watching her father's body being taken away, and she leans against her mother, and she feels the coldness of the keys that the house keys that her mother has tied to her sari, and she feels it on her hand. And that is actually, I realize now, came directly out of a memory I had of my own grandmother's death. And I remember the coldness of my mother's keys as they were preparing my grandmother's body. I mean, there are things there is a mother, when this son is going away to America, and the mother comes to see him at the airport, and he's walking away and down that corridor, and she's receding into a distance, into like a pinprick. And I think, as somebody who lived in America for 20 years, I think I have relived that journey over and over again, where you come back to family, and then as you walk away, they're still standing there. That was a time when people could come into the airport, no? And they're still standing there at that gate for that last glimpse before you turn the corner.
You know, I imagine that when you write something that might have some resonance, like the way your mother thought that this was drawn very directly from life and you were passing judgment. Um, and also, I mean, when you put that work out there, then people read it and they feel like they now know you. How do you feel about that? How do you feel about this process of, like, there is this story, it's come from somewhere, there's some of you in it, there's some of everyone else you've met in it, but you feel kind of like more known to people. And I mean, is there a reaction you have to that, or a vulnerability to that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's human nature, right? To fix things in your mind, or fix people based on very, very few and flimsy facts sometimes.
Right.
So yeah, and that happens with. The thing is, I'm a one-book wonder, so I have been very strongly associated with this book. I think for yourself as a writer, I think it can be both. It can be limiting. It can be limiting. Sometimes it's a hard act to follow. So there is that. There is that. Um, there's just one more thing I wanted to say related to autobiography and being fixed, or fixing others, which is that I think writers are they betray their friends and their families to some extent. And I didn't feel it so strongly until I saw myself represented in one of my sister's stories. And it was about childhood. It was about childhood, and it was about a vulnerable period in one's life, and we had a very strong argument. So yeah, it's a gray area. It's a gray area. You can't be disloyal to your art or your imagination, and yet I think there's an ethics to it. I've probably taken away from the question about vulnerability, Sandip.
A friend of mine once told me that never meet a writer, you admire because you run the risk of shattering all illusions you have about the writer, because you might see, love that from reading the book you form an image of the writer, and sometimes it's best to let that image stay that way. I think as a yeah, people do think they know you, and that often happens where sometimes just because my book deals with a gay man, I'll get invited to things and plonked on the some LGBT type panel, even though the primary character in my book is actually the woman who has married this man whom she later discovers is gay. So it's really her. To me, she's the moving force behind that book. So, but people fix on certain things, and as a writer, you have to let the book go. Once it's out there, people will read what they want into it, and I learned to be okay with that. And I feel like I am probably guilty of the same, where I read people's books and assume certain things about them. So if people do that, at least they've read the book, and so I'm happy about that. But even as a gamer, I've never gotten a date out of this book, though, I have to say.
So, Bijal, I mean, because your book has fantastical characters, brown clouds over Mumbai. Um, it's a lot of it is just so much science. You're drawing on that sort of like your worry for the world and that sort of thing. It's not autobiographical, but actually like you pour so much of yourself into the books that you write. They're all coming from, like, if you know Bijal the person, you know that there's actually a frightening amount of her in those books, right? What do you think? Are your books autobiographical?
I think that's true actually. In many ways, a lot of a lot of people, especially after they read Bhura, came back to me and said, "So which one are you? You must be Amni, right? Or are you Mithil?" And I was just like, "I can cook." Mithil keeps wanting to cook and keeps burning up things, and I was like, "I can cook, you know." So and they're like, "Then you must be Amni." So because she's this full nerd who's constantly trying to save the world, and they were like, "It has to be you." So Bhura, actually, I wrote it first from the perspective of Amni, who's the serious, I'm going to change the world kind of 12-year-old. And then I rewrote it completely from another character who came to me much, much later. Her name is Tammy. And she actually is, to me, became the driving force of the book. And I didn't realize it at that point, but she's based on my late partner, I realized, because she strongly talks about social justice. She comes from a very different background than her friends. And she's constantly saying all this is good, but hello, there is life to be led, and there's struggles over here that are very real. My grandparents are suffering, money is getting tight, and you all are just like, but let's save the world. Like, what is happening? So Tammy came from that space, and I only realized it much later when somebody said, "Hey, that sounds like," and I was like, oh.
That's that's really interesting, and I was wondering, do any of you want to sort of read a little bit, just maybe like a page or something, just a little bit, so because we've been talking about your books here so much, and just to get a feel of what it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, I really welcome the opportunity because it's also there are scenes set in Wards Lake, So I will read a little bit. I mean, of course, it's the Wards Lake of the 80s, so a little bit different. And it's also from children's perspective, so. But I will read a little bit. It's called Sunken Secrets. So this is the character. He's sort of a gray, dark adult, but he's also quite funny and humorous, and he entertains the kids. And so this is D, one of the kids, telling the story. Sunken Secrets. Governor piles us into the big black ambassador, which May has ordered should be turned into a taxi at the earliest, and takes us to Watts Lake to feed the fish and have a happy family time, as he says, showing us his koi-stained teeth to match his red, drunken eyes. It is a lazy summer Sunday afternoon, and we sit in his black car and go to the lake. Addie carries her plastic blue toy fish, and Clemmy carries popcorn. Governor gives me the Jim Reeves cassette cover to hold, and we sing Railroad, Steamboat, River and Canal as we go driving past the Fire Brigade building where Bor Thakur bends double as Governor honks at him, past our school where we shout, "School, school," past Kule's school where he swears loudly and tries to throw stones if he has any. When we arrive, the lake is green and there are red and yellow boats in it. Kule swears, at which Governor tries to kick him. Addie dips her toy fish in and out of the water. "It's happy now," Addie says. "How do you know?" "Because it's not a fish out of water." Clemmy drops the popcorn into the water and the fish come floating up. There, I saw the orange one." We lean on the white wooden bridge and the fish come up to eat Clemmy's popcorn. Then Clemmy drops the empty packet of popcorn into the lake too. "Never do that. You'll kill the fish." Governor crooks his finger and we follow him meekly to the grassy slopes. Kule goes off to chase the kites and bully the kite flyers. We sit around Governor, who tells us the story of Watts Lake.
That actually brought back memories of when I came here as a 6-year-old on that bridge feeding the orange and black fish. So I remember that vividly. I thought I'd just read. I'm sorry I'm lame. I'm so unused to traveling anywhere, I forgot to pack my own book. So I'm reading from my phone, which feels very unauthorly. But I thought I would read from since I talked about the great-grandmother, I'll read a little bit from that bit. And before I read, I should just say that soon after my book had come out, I saw this article online, which was listing like 13 traits of a typical South Asian sort of immigrant novel. And it said it should have something about mangoes, and it should have a wise grandmother, and it should have an intergeneration. And I went through that list, and I was like, oh shit, I have like at least 11 of those 13 in my book already. But I'm hoping that they were there for a reason. So in fact, this book covers 3 of those probably: warring generations, mango chutney, and a great-grandmother. So here goes. "I will not have it," said Romola. "Not in this house while I am alive. I have told her once, I have told her 1,000 times. I will not have jackfruit in my house. The smell makes me want to throw up." And I was reminded of this because I saw the jackfruit wine. So we were on pregnant. "But did you find any?" asked his father, Avinash, trying to be rational. "Find any? You think she was born yesterday? She has eaten every last bit, she and that old maid of hers. But the smell! My whole refrigerator smells like it was bathed in it." "Well, it's done now," said Avinash placatingly, unwilling to forsake his newspaper and step into the fight. But Romola was not to be appeased. "You think it's just for me? What about her? At her age, eating so much ripe jackfruit?" She looked at her mother-in-law for support, but Amit's grandmother had told Romola a long time ago that she did not want to handle the old lady's demands anymore. So Romola looked at Avinash and muttered, "If tomorrow she has an upset stomach, you clean up. She is your precious grandmother after all." Amit's Majinoni, his great-grandmother, was 94. She still had her own teeth, with a few missing here and there. When it suited her, she was blind. When she did not want to hear something, she was deaf. At other times, she would prop the thick black frame glasses with their almost cloudy yellowish lens on her hooked nose and peer at the newspaper with great concentration. Her favorite section was the obituaries, which she read with ghoulish relish. "Horihar Shastri died," she would announce. "He used to come to study under your grandfather-in-law. He was a full 12 years younger than me." But today, Great-grandmother was in her helpless, sightless mode, as if her spine had crumpled inside her. She sat on her bed, her plain white sari falling off her wrinkled shoulders, and peered up at Avinash. Jackfruit, black fruit, she bleated mournfully. When your grandfather still had the house in the village, we had jackfruits the size of bolsters growing in our own courtyard, and all the mangoes we could ever want. Do you remember? Ma, you make it sound like a zamindari plantation, said Amit's grandmother. I just remember a couple of mango trees. You really do exaggerate. But great-grandmother carried on undeterred. We had fresh mangoes, mango chutney, mango pickles, mango squash, even homemade mango ice cream. Where will I get that anymore? Have I legs that I'll go walking? Have I my own money that I'll buy anything? As Avinash awkwardly patted his grandmother on her shoulder, Ramula muttered darkly, "No legs? That woman has 8 legs." Amit imagined great-grandmother as an ancient, toothless spider crawling from room to room and giggled. Sometimes he would ask his father why great-grandmother survived the jackfruit without any stomach upset. She could digest iron, said Romola with grudging admiration. It's all that unadulterated milk she drank in her day. Sometimes Amit would wonder why they always seem to be butting heads. Does Ma hate Majnuni? He asked his father once. No, of course not, laughed his father. They both think they're the boss of the house, but they both love you very much.
Okay, so we start, it's 8:13 in the morning and it's really dark, which is very unusual for even Mumbai, and it's not the rainy season. On most days, Amni could see the following from the 21st floor window of their building in Glen Meadows Society. 1. Mrs. Daruwala's apartment. 2. A colorful line of Mrs. Daruwala and family's clothes hanging out to dry. 3. Pigeons roosting and pooping on the parapet. 4. A mango tree with no mangoes on it. 5. A piece of the sky. Correct. But today, Amni couldn't see anything. Correction. All she could see was a thick haze. Everything was grayish brown, like on an overcast monsoon day. There was no sky, there was no sun. A brown cloud glowered in the sky, whirling like a top. In her lifespan of 12 years, 9 months, and 10 days, Amni had never seen a cloud like this one. It was also the biggest thing she had ever seen, and Amni lived in a city crammed with tall skyscrapers and long bridges. Outside her window, it was as though the world had turned upside down, and now a turbulent, toxic ocean hovered above them. The cloud was a swirling mass of sooty grays, muddy browns, burnt yellows, gases that collided violently and restlessly into each other, like someone had appended bottles of oil paint and smashed them up viciously. Below, the neighbors were standing on the cemented path and pointing up. Ghosh uncle was bent over his phone and trying to take a selfie with the brown cloud in the background. Amni whispered, "What is that?" "I have no clue," Ma said, reaching for her phone. "Is it an eclipse, you think?" "Really? An eclipse? When was the last time you saw an eclipse that looked like a fat UFO cloud squatting on top of us?" Sometimes adults made no sense. Now the thing with adults is that either we look at social media for answers or we turn on the television. So that's what Ma does. She turns on the television. A special edition of Khabar Bhayankar, the most popular news show on television, was on. Vatudio Bauche was shouting into his microphone. Now, Amni had always thought the newscaster resembled a hyperactive crow with a slick black charcoal colored hair, shiny black suit. Today, he was like a hyperactive crow on 15 cups of coffee. "This cloud, it's the brownest cloud we've ever seen," Vatudio Bauche declared. Amni rolled her eyes. That was kind of obvious. "Climate scientists are pouring in from all over the world to study this unusual cloud that's hovering over our city. My question to you, mysterious brown cloud, is why are you here?" There was no response.
That was wonderful. I'm so glad we did the reading because all of this was really lovely. I was wondering if anyone from the audience had any questions because we're like nearly out of time. But I think we could take one or two questions if you wanted to ask any of our authors something. If, um, yeah, I don't see any hands, right? So if, okay, there's one question there.
Hey, good evening, and thank you for this session. It was lovely. I wanted to know, so I know the session is called Where Do Your Stories Come From, but when you started, did you know where they were going?
When, when you, your stories.
I think it's very rare a writer who knows where the story is going. At some point, the story will take over and lead you to places you didn't expect it to go. And this is not just true of fiction, where we are literally making up the story, but even non-fiction writers. I interviewed somebody recently who wrote the book Born a Muslim, and she said she started out thinking about a completely different book than the wide, much more sweeping book that ended up.
Any other questions? Mary has a question.
Can you tell us a bit about how stories could travel? I think we have many, many stories here to tell. They haven't traveled as much. So, can you give us a bit of advice?
Yeah, we were talking about the afterlife of the story. So yesterday, where we were talking about process and distillation and all of that, but then the afterlife, which in this day and age is also, it's the festival circuit, the prizes, the glamour of it. So that is both advantageous as well as can be paralyzing for, I was talking about my own example. My book was launched at the Jaipur Literature Festival. It got a lot of attention and it sort of paralyzed me a little bit. I couldn't, I just, like you were saying, you get fixed to the book and then you can't really come out of it. You don't know it's a tough act to follow. So there's that side of, the travel of books and stories. But I'm sure there are other aspects. Sandip and Bijal can elaborate.
I mean, I agree with that as someone who's also overdue for a next book. But I sometimes feel reassured when someone's gap is a little longer than mine. It's a terrible thing. But there is a different afterlife to stories too. And it is sometimes astonishing when years after you've written the story, you go somewhere and this has happened to me where somebody in a completely unexpected setting will tell you about something in that story that's resonated with that person so deeply in their life, and that was something that had not occurred to you. And this happened to me even it was a gay man, an older gay man, who came and said to me, who read the story, and there is a scene in there where a man who is in his 40s is going to a gay party in a city for the first time, and he's both excited and at the same time he feels like he's seeing what is possible, but it's a much younger crowd. Everyone's in their 20s, and he feels old there. So, and this person told me, I read that and I felt like I was that man where I saw the world I wanted to. It had become possible in my lifetime, and yet it was now tantalizingly just out of my reach. And it's kind of like broke my heart, actually.
Thank you, panelists, for such an intriguing take on where your stories come from. We'd like to present you with mementos. We have Mary Kurkalang, the creative director of the Shillong Cherry Blossom Literary Festival, presenting the speakers with the mementos.